Hey, you found us.
Welcome, everybody.
This is Scripture Gems. Hello, and welcome to the show. My name is John Fullmer, and this is my brother Jay.
Hey, how's it going, John?
We are two brothers who just can't get enough of the Scriptures.
Yeah, we love them.
This episode, we are going over the Come Follow Me lesson for February 28th through March 6th, 2022. This is covering Genesis chapters 28 through 33. And now let's bring out the star of the show, the Scriptures.
Oh, I know you're going to have so much to teach us today.
There's a lot of great stories. And now let's consult the Scripture-matic 6000 to find out how long it will take to read this week's reading. 34 minutes, 41 seconds.
Easy. What would it be daily?
4 minutes, 57 seconds.
We can do it. Every one of us can do it.
Just under 5 minutes.
Yeah. If you want to take it chapter by chapter, here's the time codes. Otherwise, buckle it up, and we'll talk about them all together.
And let's start with Genesis chapter 28. Now, here we have an example of kind of an awkward chapter break. Remember that the original book of Genesis was written without chapters or verses or vowels either, but that's another matter. So let's refresh on Genesis chapter 27, verse 46. It will help lead into this chapter. 27 verse 46 says, "And Rebekah said to Isaac, I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob take a wife of the daughters of Heth, such as these, which are the daughters of the land, what good shall my life do me?"
Yeah, that's a great lead-in. Let's carry it on here in chapter 28, starting in verse 1. "And Isaac called Jacob, and blessed him, and charged him, and said unto him, Thou shalt not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. Arise and go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, thy mother's father, and take thee a wife from thence of the daughters of Laban, thy mother's brother." Remember what we talked about last time about the powerful influence on families that women had in the Old Testament. Like Abraham, Isaac and Rebekah knew how important it was to find a righteous woman who would take on the covenants of the Lord. Now look as we go forward for the blessings promised.
In verse 3, "And God Almighty bless thee, and make thee fruitful, and multiply thee, that thou mayest be a multitude of people, and give thee the blessing of Abraham to thee and to thy seed with thee, that thou mayest inherit the land wherein thou art a stranger, which God gave unto Abraham." Now, to learn more about the Abrahamic covenant, check out the article in Gospel Topics. Let's review, though, what we've talked about so far in our reading. We start with numerous posterity, receiving the gospel, the blessings of the priesthood, and the blessings of salvation and eternal life, and the blessings of living in a chosen land, or the land of Canaan. Verses 5 through 9, Jacob obeyed his father by leaving the land of Canaan to find a suitable companion to marry in the house of his uncle Laban. Now, remember, Laban was Rebekah's brother. After Esau saw the blessings promised to Jacob for marrying in the covenant and realized that his marriage to Hittite women displeased his father, Esau added to his wives one of Ishmael's daughters. And if you'll remember, Ishmael was the son of Abraham and Hagar, Isaac's half-brother.
Right. So I don't think that helped, though. I appreciate what Esau was trying to do there, but I think he's missing the point. Let's go on in verse 10. "And Jacob went out from Beersheba, and went toward Haran. And he lighted upon a certain place, and tarried there all night, because the sun was set. And he took of the stones of that place, and put them for his pillows, and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it, and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereon thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed."
Now, we've mentioned a few times to keep an eye on footnotes, particularly when you're reading the Old Testament.
Right.
Here's another good example. In verse 13, look at footnote 13b. The verse says, "Behold, the Lord stood above it." But another way to translate the Hebrew would be, "The Lord stood beside him." To me, that seems more true to form for other appearances of the Lord to his prophets.
Interesting.
But let's go on with the chapter then, verse 14. "And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, And thou shalt spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And behold, I am with thee, and will keep thee in all places whither thou goest, and will bring thee again into this land. For I will not leave thee, until I have done that which I have spoken to thee of.
What an important, of all the promises he's given, I love verse 15. I am with thee. I will not leave thee. What a great blessing. That doesn't mean things will be easy. It means that the Lord will be with us as we seek to follow him, as Jacob will do.
But here we have a clear reestablishment of the covenant of Abraham with Jacob.
Yes, very true. Let's go on to verse 16. And Jacob awakened out of his sleep, and he said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I knew it not. And he was afraid, and said, How dreadful is this place! This is none other but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And Jacob rose up early in the morning, and took the stone that he had put for his pillows, and set it up for a pillar, and poured oil upon the top of it. And he called the name of that place Beth-el, but the name of that city was called Luz at the first. I think that's a better name, actually, if I was to Luz.
Agreed.
Versus Beth-el. Now, verse 17, you might be a little puzzled at that expression. How dreadful is this place? It uses expressions that refer to feelings of reverence and awe. These phrases indicate that Jacob understood the seriousness of entering the presence of God. Almost all other modern translations read this way for verse 17. He was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. That particular one is from the NIV. Also, notice that he named the place where he had his sacred experience Beth-el. As we noted, the place already had a name. Why did he change it? If you take a look at the Bible dictionary or your guide to the scriptures to look up names like that, like Beth-el, you'll see that the name means Beth, house of, and El, God.
Or sometimes, especially in the Old Testament, an even quicker lookup might be the footnotes. Check out 19b. It tells us that Beth-el means house of God.
Great catch.
A quick note on the Hebrew language here. Beth is the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It's similar in function to a Roman letter B. It looks like a box, but its shape is supposed to be a house. The letter Beth means house. And you'll see that come up in other city names as well, throughout the Old and New Testament. Most famously, for example, Bethlehem. Here, Beth means house, and Lechem means bread. The name means house of bread.
Wonderful. In verse 22, it says, And this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house.
That's awesome. There was an important Ensign article published in March of 1971 by President Marion G. Romney, and I say it was important because this is quoted not only partially in the Come Follow Me manual, but also in the Institute manual, and I think even in the seminary manual. President Romney explained why this vision of heaven was shown in the form of a ladder, and why the name of the place where it happened was called Beth-el. He says, quote, When Jacob traveled from Beersheba to Haran, he had a dream in which he saw himself on the earth at the foot of a ladder that reached to heaven where the Lord stood above it. He beheld angels ascending and descending thereon, and Jacob realized that the covenants he made with the Lord there were the rungs on the ladder that he himself would have to climb in order to obtain the promised blessings, blessings that would entitle him to enter heaven and associate with the Lord. Because he had met the Lord and entered into covenants with him there, Jacob considered the site so sacred that he named the place Beth-el, a contraction of Beth Elohim, which means literally the house of the Lord. He said of it, This is none other but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Jacob not only passed through the gate of heaven, but by living up to every covenant he also went all the way in. Of him and his forebearers, Abraham and Isaac, the Lord has said, because they did none other things than that which they were commanded, they have entered into their exaltation according to the promises, and sit upon thrones, and are not angels, but are gods. That's from Doctrine and Covenants 132, verse 37. Temples are to us all what Bethel was to Jacob. Even more, they are also the gates to heaven for all of our unendowed kindred dead. We should all do our duty in bringing our loved ones through them. End quote.
Great. Now, in Genesis 28, verses 20 through 22, Jacob vowed that if God would be with him, in verse 20, he would serve him as his God. As part of this vow, Jacob committed to pay the tenth, or tithing, to the Lord, like it mentions in verse 22. Let's go on now to Genesis chapter 29. In the first 14 verses, when Jacob arrived in Haran, he met Rachel, one of Laban's daughters, at a well. Are you seeing a pattern starting to form? If you want to meet the girl of your dreams in the Old Testament, hang around the well. Don't think this is the last time we're going to see this either. Notice Jacob's smooth moves. He sees Rachel coming with the sheep to water, and he helps by rolling back the stone covering the well. There seems to be a lot of emotion going on here. Jacob kisses Rachel and lifts up his voice and weeps. Rachel tells her dad, Laban, about Jacob's arrival, and he's so excited, he kisses Jacob. Jacob probably would have preferred Rachel do that, but
it's a different culture, maybe.
Maybe that's it. Laban welcomed Jacob to stay at his house. And when Jacob said that he was Laban's brother, see verse 12, this was another way of saying, we are families. More specifically, Laban was Jacob's uncle. Now, in verse 15, it says, and Laban said unto Jacob, because thou art my brother, shouldst thou therefore serve me for naught? Tell me, what shall thy wages be?
Now, I'm not sure, but do you remember our discussion on bargaining in Middle East culture a couple of lessons ago? I wonder if this might be another example of this kind of thing starting.
Yeah, you could read in this that each sounds very magnanimous, but they're still negotiating something here. Going on in verse 16, and Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. Now, in verse 17, tender-eyed is apparently very difficult to translate from the Hebrew. A comparison of translations, and again, a great resource for this is just type in the verse in your Google search bar or whatever search engine you're using, and it will bring up various Bible websites that you can compare translations. I go to BibleHub.com. It shows a huge variety of possibilities. Let me review some of them here. Leah had, from the NIV, weak eyes. From the NLT, no sparkle in her eyes. From the New King James Version, her eyes were delicate. She had ordinary eyes from the Holman Bible. She was blear-eyed from the Douay-Rheims Bible. Lovely or attractive eyes. Or Leah looked rather plain. So, depending on the translation, there's a whole range of what that could mean.
The Institute Manual suggests that this might mean that Leah's eyes were her most attractive feature.
Right.
That's another possibility.
Right, and there's certainly some translations that bear that out. The best we can say is that to Jacob, Leah was not as attractive as Rachel, who was beautiful in form or figure and appearance, usually referencing the face. So, going on in verse 18. And Jacob loved Rachel, and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel thy younger daughter. And Laban said, It is better that I give her to thee, than that I should give her to another man. Abide with me. Now, you might want something a little more positive, but, it's kind of a why not? Better I give her to you than somebody else. Going on in verse 20. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days for the love he had to her.
This is an interesting relationship and very romantic.
Aw.
So we'll have to see how this unfolds. In verses 21 through 29, after Jacob worked 7 years to marry Rachel, Laban tricked him into marrying his older daughter, Leah, instead. Laban justified his actions by claiming that the oldest daughter should be married first, according to the local custom. But if it seems difficult to fathom how Jacob could have been tricked in this way, the Institute Manual offers these thoughts. As sisters, Rachel and Leah may have been quite similar in height, weight, and general appearance. Second, the women of Haran sometimes veiled themselves. Third, Laban was a shepherd. If he was a typical shepherd of ancient times, he dwelt in tents instead of in permanent dwellings. The inside of a tent at night can be very dark. And finally, knowing what the reaction of Jacob would be if he discovered the substitution early, Laban may have told Leah to speak as little as possible, so as not to give the deception away before it was too late to change it. Now Laban told Jacob he could still marry Rachel after the week-long wedding feast for Leah, but Jacob would have to agree to work with him for another 7 years, and Jacob agreed to these conditions. Remember that although this may seem strange to us that he is marrying 2 women, the Lord approved of Jacob's plural marriages, as we talked about when we studied Doctrine and Covenants, section 132.
So let's go on then and take a look at some of the challenges that Jacob and his family faced, starting in verse 30. And he went in also unto Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served with him yet 7 other years. And when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And Leah conceived and bare a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, Surely the Lord hath looked upon my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. And she conceived again and bare a son, and said, Because the Lord hath heard that I was hated, he hath therefore given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. And she conceived again and bare a son, and said, Now this time will my husband be joined unto me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore was his name called Levi. And she conceived again and bare a son, and she said, Now will I praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah, and left bearing.
So did Jacob really hate Leah? After all, she would end up bearing him over half his children. The Institute Manual provides this insight. The Hebrew word saneh does not mean hate, as the term is used today, but rather conveys the idea of loving less. A better translation would be, when the Lord saw that Leah was loved less, or was not as favored, he opened her womb. Also, once again, keep an eye on the footnotes in these verses. There's wordplay here that would not be lost on a Hebrew-speaking audience, but that we might miss. In verse 32, Leah's first son is named Reuben, which means, Look, a son, because surely the Lord hath looked upon my affliction. Wordplay.
Nice.
Verse 33, Leah's second son is named Simeon, meaning hearing, because the Lord hath heard that I was hated. Verse 34, Leah's third son is named Levi, meaning joined, because now this time will my husband be joined unto me. Verse 35, Leah's fourth son is named Judah, meaning praise, because now will I praise the Lord. And it goes on like this. Remember, later Israelites took a great deal of pride in the tribe that they descended from. Each has a special significance. Watch for that.
And if you're wondering how you can find the meaning of those names, because those are really great parallels, don't forget to check out your study helps, Guide to the Scriptures or your Bible dictionary. Look up those names, and they'll often give you the meaning.
Also, remember, we don't understand a lot of what is going on here. But whatever Leah's situation is, the Lord blessed her with Levi, through whose lineage the priesthood would be kept, and Judah, whose lineage would bring forth King David and eventually Jesus Christ himself.
Right. So let's go on now to chapter 30, starting in verse 1. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister, and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. and Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. And he said, Am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb?
Now here's a really interesting exchange. Rachel is watching her sister bear 4 children to her husband, and yet she is still barren. This was obviously emotionally crippling to Rachel. So she cries out to Jacob. But Jacob reminds her that it's not up to him. Little has changed, even thousands of years later. We may understand a lot more about the human reproductive system and the miracle of life, but for anyone that has started their own family, it's quickly recognized that it's not really up to the mother or the father when a new life will come. Now, coming up, we're going to get into a discussion about handmaids. The idea of handmaids might certainly seem foreign to modern cultures. A handmaid would be the personal servant of a woman. In the United States today, it would certainly seem strange to most to have a personal servant. But my wife had some interesting insights in that regard. We have clearly taken for granted many innovations that we have today that help with heating and cooling, food preparation and preservation, and cleaning. In times past, these tasks were often more than one person could do. In many ways, our modern appliances have become our servants or handmaids today.
Oh, good observation. Now, the Institute Manual gives this additional insight about Jacob's marriages to Laban's daughters. It says, Though Laban demanded another 7 years for Rachel's hand, he allowed Jacob to marry her once the 7 days of wedding feasts for Leah were finished, and to fulfill his indebtedness after the marriage. The gift of the handmaidens to each daughter made the servants the direct property of each wife, not of Jacob. Thus, later, when the handmaids had children, the children were viewed legally as the children of Rachel and Leah. So, as a refresher, Leah's handmaid was named Zilpah, and Rachel's was named Bilhah. Jacob now has 4 sons, all from Leah, and Leah left bearing, meaning she was done having children. The NET translates this as she stopped having children. In verses 3 through 8, Rachel, in some ways, has a similar moment to Sarah, Jacob's grandmother. She realized that she cannot have a child, and the fertility problem is obviously not with Jacob, so she gives her handmaid Bilhah to Jacob, her husband, as a 3rd wife. This might remind us of Sarah giving Hagar to Abraham. Bilhah bears 2 sons, and here again we get some wordplay. Also notice that Bilhah bears the children. Rachel names them. This is actually how it's supposed to be, although it didn't work out that way for Sarah and Hagar. The first son of Bilhah is named Dan, and, check the footnote, Dan means he has judged, because God hath judged me, she says. The second son from Bilhah is named Naphtali, meaning my wrestling, because with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed.
So take that, Leah. So going on in verses 9 to 13. Now Leah was hardly going to let this go unchallenged. She knew she had stopped having children, so she gave her own handmaid, Zilpah, to Jacob as a 4th wife. Once again, Zilpah bears the children, but they are considered legally the children of Leah, just like Bilhah's children legally belong to Rachel. Leah and Rachel both named their respective handmaids children. Some scholars have suggested that as the handmaids have been given as wives, they are now concubines, or wives but of a lower social status. Zilpah gives birth to Gad, meaning good fortune. Footnote 11b explains that this is an even further wordplay on the Hebrew word gedud, meaning troop, which is why she explains that she names him this because a troop cometh. Zilpah's next son is Asher, meaning happy, because happy am I.
Nice. Going on in verse 14. And Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field, and brought them unto his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, Give me, I pray thee, of thy son's mandrakes. And she said unto her, Is it a small matter that thou hast taken my husband? And wouldst thou take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, Therefore he shall lie with thee tonight for thy son's mandrakes.
So, what the heck are mandrakes? And why would Rachel be so anxious to trade a romantic evening with their husband for them? The Bible Dictionary has an entry for mandrakes. It says, the Hebrew name denotes love fruit. The fruit had a pleasant taste and odor and was supposed to ensure conception. The Institute Manual adds, in other words, the mandrakes were thought to enhance a woman's fertility and ability to have children. So it would seem that Rachel's desperation was around a superstition regarding this fruit. The fruit was supposed to encourage fertility, but as we discussed earlier, ultimately the Lord decides when children are going to come. Either way, Rachel was clearly desperate enough to try anything at this point. So, in the next few verses, 16 to 21, what was the result? Leah miraculously conceived and bore 2 more sons and a daughter. Rachel's plot kind of backfired.
Superstition, eh?
Leah has a son named Issachar. Interestingly, no one is quite sure what this name means, but it possibly means there is a recompense. And this would fit with Leah's declaration, God hath given me my hire, or recompense. The next son is named Zebulun, which means exalted abode, because now will my husband dwell with me, or honor or exalt me. And finally, she gives birth to a daughter named Dinah. We're not told why she named her this, but the name Dinah means God will judge. Given that, it seems to be a feminine form of Dan. So going on in the story, verse 22, and God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her, and opened her womb. And she conceived, and bare a son, and said, God hath taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. Now you'd be right to assume there's more wordplay here. Footnote on verse 24a tells us Joseph relates both to the Hebrew root Yasef, to add, and Asaph, meaning to take away or to gather. The context plays upon all these meanings. Now, Jacob has 11 sons and a daughter. The youngest of Jacob's sons, Benjamin, has not yet been born.
So, in verses 25 through 43, because Jacob was faithful to his covenants, the Lord blessed him by increasing his wealth. When he had fulfilled his time with Laban, he was ready to return to Canaan. Laban wanted him to stay because, he said, I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake, in verse 27. Laban asked Jacob to choose his wages, and in response, Jacob separates the herd, taking all the speckled and spotted goats and brown sheep, 3 days' journey away from the remainder of the flock, which is with Laban. God prospers Jacob exceedingly, so that he had, quote, much cattle and maidservants and menservants and camels and asses, in verse 43. You might have noticed in these verses that cattle is being used collectively for both goats and sheep. The word as used in the King James usually means livestock or flocks.
You'll find that that's actually true of the King's English. Words like corn and cattle in America usually mean something much more specific, but in the King's English, much more broad.
Nice.
So that brings us to chapter 31. Let's take a look at the story here in verse 1. And he heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's, and of that which was our father's hath he gotten all his glory. And Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before. And the Lord said unto Jacob, Return unto the land of thy fathers, and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee.
So Jacob finds himself kind of between a rock and a hard place. His in-laws are turning against him, but remember that back home his brother Esau is waiting to kill him. Check in Genesis chapter 27, verses 41 to 43. So think about how important is the Lord's promise in verse 3, I will be with thee. So in verses 4 through 23, Jacob counsels with his wives about the command of the Lord and reminds them how Laban has mistreated and deceived him because he changed my wages 10 times. But God suffered him not to hurt me. Verse 7. In other words, the Lord continued to prosper Jacob despite his mistreatment. Then he tells them of his dream, where God commanded him to now arise, get thee out of this land, and return unto the land of thy kindred, in verse 13. His wives respond faithfully with, whatsoever God hath said unto thee, do, in verse 16.
That's great. I love that. From the Institute Manual, we get this additional insight. It is interesting that both Rachel and Leah agreed that Jacob was justified in leaving Laban. They also pointed out that they had received nothing from their father because of his covetous nature. One commentator explained their bitterness. The dowry was an important part of marriage. We meet it first in Jacob, who worked 7 years for Laban to earn a dowry for Rachel. The pay for this service belonged to the bride as her dowry, and Rachel and Leah could indignantly speak of themselves as having been sold by their father because he had withheld from them their dowry. It was the family capital. It represented the wife's security in case of divorce where the husband was at fault. If she were at fault, she forfeited it. She could not alienate it from her children. There are indications that the normal dowry was about 3 years' wages. The dowry thus represented funds provided by the father of the groom or by the groom through work used to further the economic life of the new family. If the father of the bride added to this, it was his privilege and customary, but the basic dowry was from the groom or his family. The dowry was thus the father's blessing on his son's marriage, or a test of the young man's character in working for it.
So they began to journey after this to the land of Canaan while Laban was away shearing his sheep. As they left, Rachel took some of Laban's images, as it mentions in verse 19. The word images could refer to household idols, although some believe the images could represent Rachel's dowry. We do not know why Rachel took the images or why Laban later referred to them as my gods, coming up in 31 verse 30.
The Institute Manual adds this insight. There is much debate among scholars about what the images were that were stolen by Rachel and what they represented. The Hebrew word which is sometimes used for small images of false gods is teraphim. Some translators render the word as household gods. One scholar theorized that these images were somehow tied with the legal rights of inheritance. If this theory is correct, the possessor of the teraphim had the right to inherit the father's property. This circumstance would explain why Rachel stole the images, since her father had stolen her inheritance. It would also explain Laban's extreme agitation over their loss and Jacob's severe penalty offered against the guilty party.
And that's coming up. So when Laban returned home, he learned of Jacob's departure and discovered that his images were missing. He chased after Jacob and his family, and after 7 days overtook them. Let's take a look in verse 24 and look how the Lord kept his promise and was with Jacob. In verse 24, and God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night, and said unto him, Take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. Then Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the mount, and Laban with his brethren pitched in the mount of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, What hast thou done, that thou hast stolen away unawares to me, and carried away my daughters as captives taken with the sword? Wherefore didst thou flee away secretly, and steal away from me, and didst not tell me, that I might have sent thee away with mirth, and with songs, with tabret, and with harp? And hast not suffered me to kiss my sons and my daughters? Thou hast now done foolishly in so doing. It is in the power of my hand to do you hurt. But the God of your father spake unto me yesternight, saying, Take thou heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. In verses 30 through 40, Laban searched Jacob's camp for his images, but did not find them, because Rachel hid them under the cushion she used to sit on a camel. In verse 35, we find an interesting excuse that she gives for not being able to move so he can search that cushion. If you didn't catch it, the NIV translation makes it clear. It says, Rachel said to her father, Don't be angry, my lord, that I cannot stand up in your presence. I'm having my period. I love the Old Testament because It can and will talk about anything in the human experience. It is not bashful. And one of the things that I love about that is that it reminds me God is a part of everything in our life. He's not embarrassed to talk about or bring up anything, and we shouldn't be when we approach him.
Good point. And I'll have to confess, it was probably years after I was married when I was reading through the Old Testament and I finally read, "The custom of women is upon me," and realized, oh, that's what she's talking about. And so here's where a much more modern translation made it very plain. Now, granted, I'm male. That's probably why I didn't get it much earlier. But one more insight. My wife pointed out, we don't necessarily know that Rachel is lying in this instance.
Oh, for sure.
Remember that Benjamin hasn't been born yet. So it could very well happen to have been a convenient excuse.
Well, it certainly saved her because not only did she avoid any problems with her father, but in verse 32, Jacob was so defensive against Laban that he said, "With whomsoever thou findest thy gods, let him not live." And so it was important that Rachel not be found out. So after Laban had finished searching for the images, and of course he didn't find them, Jacob recounted how Laban had mistreated him numerous times during the preceding 20 years.
In verse 41, "Thus have I been 20 years in thy house. I served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters, and 6 years for thy cattle, and thou hast changed my wages 10 times. Except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had been with me, surely thou hadst sent me away now empty. God hath seen mine affliction, and the labor of my hands, and rebuked thee yesternight." So take that, Laban.
Yeah.
So now in the remaining verses of that chapter, Jacob and Laban make a covenant that they would not harm each other, and Laban then returned to his own land.
And that brings us to Genesis chapter 32. Let's start in verse 1. "And Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, This is God's host. And he called the name of the place Mahanaim." Remember, if you're looking at a name, you're safest if you pronounce all the vowels. Mahanaim. "And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother, unto the land of Seir, the country of Edom. And he commanded them, saying, Thus shall ye speak unto my lord Esau. Thy servant Jacob saith thus, I have sojourned with Laban, and stayed there until now. And I have oxen and asses, flocks and men servants and women servants, and I have sent to tell my lord, that I may find grace in thy sight. And the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, We came to thy brother Esau, and also he cometh to meet thee, and 400 men with him. Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that was with him, and the flocks and herds and the camels into 2 bands, and said, And if Esau come to the one company, and smite it, then the other company which is left shall escape. Now I could see why he would be so concerned, but didn't the Lord say that he would be with him? Does this cautious behavior show a lack of faith, or does Jacob understand that he needs to do all that he can to be wise?
Let's take a look at what happens. Verse 9, "And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, the Lord which saidst unto me, Return to thy country and to thy kindred, and I will deal well with thee. I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which thou hast showed unto thy servant. For with my staff I passed over this Jordan, and now I am become 2 bands. Deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau. For I fear him, lest he will come and smite me, and the mother with the children. And thou hast said, I will surely do thee good, and make thy seed as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude."
So as you look at these verses, what impresses you about this prayer? Notice the combination of obedience, personal action, and prayerful pleading. I can't blame his caution. Jacob has no idea what he's walking into. But what a faithful prayer.
Let's take a look at verse 13. And he lodged there that same night, and took of that which came to his hand a present for Esau his brother, 200 she-goats, and 20 he-goats, 200 ewes, and 20 rams, 30 milch camels, and their colts, 40 kine, that's cows, and 10 bulls, 20 she-asses, and 10 foals. And he delivered them into the hand of his servants, every drove by themselves, and said unto his servants, Pass over before me, and put a space betwixt drove and drove. And he commanded the foremost, saying, When Esau my brother meeteth thee, and asketh thee, saying, Whose art thou? And whither goest thou? And whose are these before thee? Then thou shalt say, They be thy servant Jacob's. It is a present sent unto my lord Esau, and behold, also he is behind us.
So John clarified the kine as cows. The milch camels mean milking camels. So Jacob instructed his servants to divide nearly 600 of his animals into many groups and deliver them one group at a time to Esau as gifts. So when we face difficulties, notice what we learn from this. We should pray earnestly for help and then do what we can to overcome the problem. In verses 22 through 23, Jacob arranged to have some time alone. Going on in verse 24, And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint, as he wrestled with him. And he said, Let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. Now, from the seminary manual, it offers this insight. Although we do not know exactly what was transpiring here, we do know that Jacob wrestled all night for a blessing that he eventually received. This experience represents the great effort Jacob put forth as he sought this blessing from the Lord. And remember how important that idea is. There are times when we don't know the specific events or the kind of literature or the way a narrative is sculpted to teach a particular theology or lesson. The most important thing is for us to look for the lesson. Sometimes we'll know the background and sometimes what's happening will make sense, but sometimes it won't.
Remember that we're dealing with a very different culture. For those of us in the West, we take things very literally. In the East, they take things very symbolically and often employ symbolism when they are telling their stories.
Right. Now, we have our own idioms too, but we'll probably talk about those as we go along.
True.
If you look at the footnote for wrestle in verse 24, it reminds us of others such as Enos and Alma who wrestled with God in mighty prayer, seeking for a blessing, like in Enos 1 and Alma 8.
So what is the blessing that Jacob receives? Verse 27, And he said unto him, What is thy name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. And Jacob asked him and said, Tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, Wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name? And he blessed him there. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Now notice the footnote on Peniel in verse 30. First of all, notice the L in the name, E-L. That is God. And so the meaning of this word will have something to do with God. The footnote tells us that Peniel means the face of God.
Very nice. And again, even though we're not sure, was it a prophet he wrestled with? Was it God he wrestled with? Was it an angel? It's interesting that even the angel helps to focus his mind in this experience. My name, as God's servant perhaps, is not important. What's important in this interaction is your name and what that means about the blessing that you've just received. President Russell M. Nelson pleaded with the Lord to increase his understanding of the gathering of Israel as he studied the scriptures. In the October 2020 General Conference in a talk called Let God Prevail, he shares some insights. He says, quote, "So imagine my delight when I was led recently to a new insight. With the help of 2 Hebrew scholars, I learned that one of the Hebraic meanings of the word Israel is let God prevail. Thus, the very name of Israel refers to a person who is willing to let God prevail in his or her life. That concept stirs my soul." The word willing is crucial to this interpretation of Israel. We all have our agency. We can choose to be of Israel or not. We can choose to let God prevail in our lives or not. We can choose to let God be the most powerful influence in our lives or not. For a moment, let us recall a crucial turning point in the life of Jacob, the grandson of Abraham. At the place Jacob named Peniel, which means the face of God, Jacob wrestled with a serious challenge. His agency was tested. Through this wrestle, Jacob proved what was most important to him. He demonstrated that he was willing to let God prevail in his life. In response, God changed Jacob's name to Israel, meaning let God prevail. God then promised Israel that all the blessings that had been pronounced upon Abraham's head would also be his.
I love that. That was a great insight from President Nelson. I remember that talk well. Let's go on to chapter 33, starting in verse 1. "And Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men. And he divided the children unto Leah, and unto Rachel, and unto the 2 handmaids. And he put the handmaids and their children foremost, and Leah and her children after, and Rachel and Joseph hindermost. And he passed over before them, and bowed himself to the ground 7 times, until he came near to his brother. And Esau ran to meet him, and embraced him, and fell on his neck, and kissed him, and they wept. And he lifted up his eyes, and saw the women and the children, and said, Who are those with thee? And he said, The children which God hath graciously given thy servant. Then the handmaidens, they and their children, and they bowed themselves. And Leah also with her children came near, and bowed themselves. And after came Joseph near, and Rachel, and they bowed themselves. And he said, What meanest thou by all this drove which I met? And he said, These are to find grace in the sight of my Lord. And Esau said, I have enough, my brother. Keep that thou hast unto thyself. And Jacob said, Nay, I pray thee, if now I have found grace in thy sight, then receive my present at my hand. For therefore I have seen thy face, as though I had seen the face of God, and thou wast pleased with me. Take, I pray thee, my blessing that is brought to thee, because God hath dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough. And he urged him, and he took it.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Now, let's examine some things here. First of all, you may have felt as you're reading the arrangement, again, not knowing what kind of hostility they might meet, that he put the handmaids first, then Leah, then Rachel, as if he was trying to protect that which was most important. But that isn't how it played out, because Jacob himself passed over in front of them and bowed himself to the ground. He put himself out front. It seemed to be some order in which he wanted to introduce them. Also, let's take a look at what Jacob and Esau did to overcome their damaged relationship. One thing may have been time, but also Jacob addressed Esau using respectful terms. He showed courtesy, humility, and reverence by bowing before Esau, and he offered a generous gift to Esau. Now, to have forgiveness, it takes 2 people. Notice what Esau did. He ran to meet Jacob. He embraced him. He wept with him. And Esau also accepted Jacob's gift, like we just read in verse 11. Elder Marion D. Hanks, in an article in the January 1974 Ensign, talks about forgiveness. He says, What is our response when we are offended, misunderstood, unfairly or unkindly treated or sinned against, made an offender for a word, falsely accused, passed over, hurt by those we love, our offerings rejected? Do we resent, become bitter, hold a grudge? Or do we resolve the problem if we can, forgive, and rid ourselves of the burden? The nature of our response to such situations may well determine the nature and quality of our lives, here and eternally. Even if it appears that another may be deserving of our resentment or hatred, none of us can afford to pay the price of resenting or hating because of what it does to us.
Nice. Well, going on in the chapter, verses 12 to 17, after Jacob and Esau's reunion, Esau offered to travel with Jacob and his family as they continued their journey to the land of Canaan. Jacob said his caravan would need to travel at a slow pace because of the animals and children, and suggested that Esau proceed without them. Esau then returned to the land of Seir. So then what happens? Let's look in verse 18. And Jacob came to Shalem, a city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padan Aram, and pitched his tent before the city. And he bought a parcel of a field where he had spread his tent, at the hand of the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. And he erected there an altar, El Elohe Israel.
Now the name of the altar Jacob built in Shalem means El, God, is the God of Israel. Again, don't forget to check your footnotes. By dedicating this altar, Jacob confirmed his promise that if God would help him return home in peace, then the Lord would be his God.
Wow.
Well, I have nothing else to say.
Yeah, there's nothing else to say. We have the formation of Israel. Jacob now becomes Israel, and this will be the name by which the followers of God will be identified for millennia, even today.
And it's interesting to be able to see the price that was paid, the sacrifices so that people could make these covenants, and how they were willing to let God prevail in their lives, even through scary situations, challenging situations, unfair situations, and yet always to let God prevail.
Well, I hope that you have gained some greater insight and perhaps found a few gems in this lesson. Keep reading your scriptures, and we'll look forward to talking to you more about them in our next lesson.
We'll see you then.
This podcast is not officially affiliated with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints,
but we're really big fans.